Here are all the changes I noticed, which were made to the Rainbow Magic number 20 Phoebe the Fashion Fairy United States Edition. In the illustration, the sweet shop becomes the candy shop. In the opening poem, Have They becomes They Have, Jubilee becomes Anniversary, All Fairyland becomes All of Fairyland, Shine Your Wand becomes Pull Out Your Wand, Press Your Dress becomes Fanciest Dress. HRH is removed from the fairy godmother's name. The numbering changes. The American edition starts on page 1, the British edition starts on page 9. Chapter 1. Hairband becomes headband, nearly becomes almost, mum becomes mom. Party Fairies of Fairyland becomes Party Fairies. Grumpy Jack Frost becomes Jack Frost. Goblin Servants becomes Goblins. Into the World to cause trouble at human parties becomes Into the Human World to cause trouble at parties. Put Things Right becomes Set Things Straight. Magical becomes Magic, which meant that becomes So. Extra Specially becomes Especially. We've Met becomes We've Helped. Nearly All becomes Almost All. Honey the Sweet Fairy becomes Honey the Candy Fairy. Kirsty Put In becomes Kirsty Finished. I Expect So becomes I Bet We Will. Try and Get becomes Try to Steal. The sentence starting with one of them is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Set Things Right becomes Fix Everything. It Was to Rival becomes He Wanted His Party to Be Better Than. Jubilee becomes Anniversary. Organized becomes Planned. For the end of the week becomes To Take Place at the end of the week. Jubilee Celebrations becomes Anniversary Celebration. Spoil becomes Ruin. Party Fairies Party Magic becomes Party Fairies Magic. The sentence starting with Christy Ring is split into two sentences at the word and, which is deleted. Was looking becomes looked. Asked in concern becomes asked concerned. Best dress becomes favorite dress. Has been ruined becomes is ruined. How becomes what happened. Her wardrobe door becomes the door of her closet. Splodges becomes splotches. Perfectly clean becomes totally clean. Mum becomes mom. Spoiled dress becomes stained dress. Hasn't had becomes didn't have. And marched becomes marching. Called down the garden becomes called down to the yard. Come here at once becomes come here. Moments becomes minutes. Looking very pleased becomes looked very pleased. Loads of worms becomes tons of worms. Brandishing becomes holding up. Spade becomes shovel. Vigorously is removed from he shook his head vigorously. In the garden becomes outside. Mum becomes mom. I suppose becomes I guess. Looking baffled becomes looking confused. Deliberately becomes on purpose. Sort of thing becomes kind of thing. Nearby becomes close by. Chapter 2. We've got becomes we have. Pop round becomes run over. I've still got becomes I still have. The fairy cakes becomes the cupcakes. To ice becomes to frost. To ice and the fairy cakes swap places in the sentence. She frowned is added after in time. We'll ice the cakes for you becomes we can decorate the cupcakes. Rachel put in becomes Rachel added. Kind becomes nice. The sentence starting with then while is split into two sentences at the word where, which is removed. Then while is removed. Whisked becomes took. And is inserted between cleaned up and Mrs. Ingle. Food had all been laid out becomes food was all set out. Fairy cakes becomes cupcakes. A piping bag becomes a piping bag for squeezing the icing in pretty designs. She said, setting them out, becomes Mrs. Ingle said, and it's moved to after the word girls. Mum becomes mom. Spoiled becomes ruin. Not so long ago becomes recently. Wardrobe becomes closet. Flung the doors wide open becomes open the doors wide. Peeped becomes peaked. Wardrobe becomes closet. Beneath becomes under. Duvet, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Duvet or dovet? Anyway, it becomes bedspread. Checked on all becomes checked on top of all. Cupboards becomes shelves. Clever becomes sneaky. He's left becomes he left. Get on with those cakes becomes start those cupcakes. Spoiling becomes ruining. Icing becomes frosting. Cakes becomes cupcakes. Heart shapes becomes icing. Hundreds and thousands becomes sprinkles. She urged becomes she cried. Looked up becomes looked up just in time. The sentence, they couldn't believe their eyes, is added before the last sentence of the chapter. Chapter 3. Long wavy blonde hair becomes wavy blonde hair. Alice band becomes headband. Had a ruby heart at one end becomes let off ruby hearts. Kirsty and Rachel, isn't it? Becomes Kirsty and Rachel, right? Sweet fairy becomes candy fairy. Sort everything out becomes fix everything. The sentence starting with, well, we're very, is split into two sentences at the word and, which becomes she. Charlotte's dress becomes Charlotte's special dress. Clear these icing things away becomes clean up the decorating supplies. Fairy cakes becomes cupcakes. Gathering up becomes gathering. Cakes becomes cupcakes. She said admiringly becomes she said. Hovering over the table in midair becomes hovering over the table. The king and queen of fairyland themselves becomes the king and queen of fairyland. I can't see becomes I don't see. Looked round becomes looked around. A moment ago becomes a minute ago. It's vanished becomes it's gone. Said these words becomes said that. Will's toy box becomes Will's nearby toy box. Flew back becomes flew open. Toy chest becomes box. Piping bag becomes icing bag. Piping bag becomes icing bag. Tummy becomes stomach. Fell becomes fell through the air. Red jelly becomes strawberry jello. Then bounced becomes bounced. The sentence starting with luckily she landed is split into two sentences at the word arms, which becomes her arms. Flailing becomes flailed. Squelch becomes squish. Back into the jelly, Phoebe plunged becomes Phoebe plunged back into the jello. The sentence starting with she was quite is split into two sentences at the word and, which is deleted. She was quite unhurt becomes she wasn't hurt. Lost her grip on becomes lost hold of. I was after becomes I was looking for. Chortled becomes cackled. Round becomes around. To try and reach becomes to try to reach. And the goblins becomes the goblins. Gnarly green hand becomes green hand. Chapter 4. Grinned nastily becomes gave a nasty grin. Snatched up becomes snatched. A fairy cake becomes a cupcake. Leapt out becomes leaped out. Garden becomes backyard. Jelly becomes jello. Horrible Jack Frost becomes Jack Frost. Pieces of jelly becomes chunks of red jello. Fairy sized becomes fairy size. That goblin thief becomes the goblin. The sentence starting with Kirsty and Rachel is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Shut their eyes in delight becomes shut their eyes. Got to work becomes started working. Flying a little loop-the-loop becomes doing a little flip. It was so much fun to be able to fly becomes being able to fly was so much fun. Running down becomes racing through. The garden becomes a yard. Fairy cake becomes cupcake. As he went becomes as he ran. Wendy house becomes playhouse. Here and everywhere else it appears. And that's just a 1-to-1 ratio. It's always called Wendy house in the British edition, always called playhouse in the American edition. The sentence starting with the next moment is split into two sentences at the word and, which becomes he. Bottom of becomes far end of. Garden becomes yard. She ordered crossly becomes she ordered. Phoebe sighed and tried becomes Phoebe tried. Holding tight to the handle becomes holding on to the handle. For becomes because. It's no good becomes it's no use. Phoebe wailed becomes Phoebe said, sighing. Right, Rachel said, becomes okay, Rachel said. Grabbing hold of becomes grabbing. The sentence starting with there was a is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. It won't budge becomes it won't turn. Cakes becomes cupcakes. Perhaps becomes maybe. More cakes becomes more treats. Brilliant idea becomes great idea. Flourish becomes twirl. Fairy cakes becomes cupcakes. Cakes becomes cupcakes. Whizzing becomes zooming. Puring becomes peeking. Cakes becomes cupcakes. He's seen them becomes he sees them. She hissed becomes Phoebe whispered to the girls. I'm pretty sure the she referred to Kirsty, which means the American edition changed who said this line. Fairy cakes becomes cupcakes. Rachel whispered becomes Rachel said. The sentence starting with the goblin is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Eagerly is moved to after the word face. Peeping in becomes looking. Measly fairy cakes becomes tiny cupcakes. You've got another think coming becomes you've got another thing coming. More cakes becomes more cupcakes. Looked at her in horror becomes looked at her with wide eyes. Mum becomes mom. Chapter 5. Stared around becomes looked around. The garden becomes the yard. Rachel spotted the garden hose and becomes when Rachel spotted the garden hose. Turn the tap on becomes turn the water on. That nasty goblin becomes the goblin. Chuckled becomes giggled. Hose pipe becomes hose. Outside tap becomes outside faucet. There came a great becomes there was a huge. Yelp becomes scream. Lovely becomes nice. Got louder becomes grew louder. Shan't becomes no way. Retorted becomes answered. Warn you, goblin becomes warn you. Racing over to turn the tap on fully becomes turning the faucet on all the way. Water poured into the Wendy house in torrents becomes water poured into the playhouse. Bobbing helplessly around becomes bobbing around helplessly. Wedge the door shut becomes keep the door shut. The chair was knocked aside becomes he accidentally kicked the chair aside. Flapped about becomes flopped about. The sentence starting with, but it was, is split into two sentences after the word impossible. Down the garden becomes down the backyard. To the pond becomes to the Ingalls Koi Pond. Splosh becomes splash. Into the pond went the goblin becomes the goblin spilled right into the pond. Laughing becomes giggling. Clamber out becomes climb out. Duckweed becomes weeds. Plaster to his head becomes stuck to his head. He looked very sorry for himself becomes he looked very glum. Magic him becomes twirl my wand to give him. Chuckled becomes laughed. Some swimming trunks becomes a swimsuit. A swimming hat becomes swim cap. Squelch, squelch, squelch becomes squish, squish, squish. Turn the tap off becomes turn the water off. She hissed becomes she yelled. The garden becomes the whole backyard. A mud bath becomes a mud pit. Jelly becomes jello mold. How on earth becomes how. Mum becomes mom. All sorts becomes all kinds. Nothing would shift it becomes nothing worked. I know the dress is special to you, but is added before, you'll just have to choose something else. Mrs. Ingle went on becomes Mrs. Ingle added. A puzzled frown appeared between her eyebrows becomes a frown appeared on her face. They removed the lines between Mrs. Ingle's eyebrows in the illustration to match this change. She took in becomes she noticed. Damp clothes becomes wet clothes. Rather wet becomes soaked. How to explain her bedraggled appearance becomes how to explain. Rachel put in hastily becomes Rachel said quickly. A bit splashed becomes a little wet. The icing things becomes the things for the icing. Frown lifted becomes frown cleared. Fairy cakes becomes cupcakes. All finished becomes all decorated. Towards becomes toward. Well, becomes we. Time to magic the Wendy house back to normal becomes time to magically clean up the playhouse. Sort out the dining room becomes fix everything in the dining room. Rachel and Kirsty weren't sure, but they were about to find out, ready or not. It's added to the end of the chapter. Chapter 6. Shouldn't becomes should not. Clever Phoebe becomes Phoebe. The fairy cakes becomes the cupcakes. On their plate once more becomes on their plate. Jelly becomes jello. Nobody would ever dream becomes nobody could even imagine. 20 minutes ago becomes 20 minutes earlier. Turn to Rachel questioningly becomes turn to Rachel. Had noticed no such thing becomes had not noticed anything. Fairy cakes becomes cupcakes. You're clever becomes you're talented. Come quickly becomes come here, now. Wardrobe door becomes closet door. Gorgeous becomes beautiful. Beautiful deep red becomes deep red. All covered becomes covered. Hairband becomes headband. Lilac becomes purple. Charlotte breathes becomes Charlotte whispered. Herb becomes Something else as well becomes something else too. Present they'd wrapped up becomes present they'd wrapped. Twinkling becomes sparkling. Magical becomes magic. Last bit becomes last piece. Gorgeous becomes pretty. Hairband becomes headband. Wrapped up becomes wrapped. Gleaming golden necklace becomes golden necklace. No doubt becomes I bet. I must go becomes I have to go. Mum becomes mom. Peeped out becomes peeked out. The sentence starting with a smile is split into three sentences at the words and while, which are removed. Pleased becomes happy. Happy to help becomes glad to help. Happy to help becomes we're glad to help too. They chorused becomes they chorused together. Hug them becomes hug them both. Lovely becomes wonderful. I must becomes I have to. Kirsty said happily becomes Kirsty said with a grin. We certainly have becomes we definitely have. And I can't becomes I can't. That is 306 changes to the 65-page book, or 4.7 changes per page. The actual number of changes is slightly higher because I grouped all the Wendy House changes together into one change.